Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jed Lee, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so happy that you're part of our beautiful Reading with Your Kids family. We are praying that you and your family are staying safe and enjoying some great family time together. Our guest today is Matt Beighton. He is the author of the super Monstacademy Series. Before we invite Matt in, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by The Big City Dance by Valerie Doherty, a brand new picture book that is absolutely incredible. Mo Doodle is a country mouse who decides to move to the big city in search of excitement and adventure. Although he finds plenty of fun, he soon realizes that he is homesick and missing his friends. This great story is told in a bouncing rhyme and rhythm with incorporated dance movements for young listeners and readers. Discover how Mo solves his problems while exploring and living in the big city. This is a great book for children 3 years old and older. A super book for you and your family to read together. You're going to love the rhymes. You're going to love the illustrations. It's The Big City Dance by Valerie Doherty. Joining us right now from Leicester in the Midlands of the United Kingdom. He is the author of a wonderful series called Monstacademy. Please welcome to the show, Matt Beighton. Matt, how are you?
Great. Thank you very much for having me on, Jed.
Matt and I were just talking about Leicester, and he was telling me that a few years ago, the Leicester football team won the Premier Cup. Is it Premier Cup?
Yeah, the Premier League. Yeah,
Premier League. Yeah. And he also told me something interesting about something that they found that was quite surprising. Can you remind me what that was?
Yeah, they found the remains of King Richard III in a council car park. Well, underneath a council car park. It hadn't always obviously been a car park. When he was buried there, it was a church a church. And so obviously they buried him there after the Battle of Bosworth. And he wasn't found again until 2016. When they dug him up in the car park.
Wow. As a king, he must have been kind of bummed out. Like, oh, you guys lost me here. I was like your leader for so long.
I know. Imagine how many people park their cars on top of him.
I know. And one of the things you were talking to me about, as they were digging him up, and it's a big process and everything, were a lot of people complaining that, hey, I don't have anywhere to park now.
Well, it was such an exciting thing. I mean, the University of Leicester were massively involved. The historians there, the archaeologists there, and so there was a lot. It was quite a big excitement in the town. You could get once they'd opened up the burial site, they kind of fenced it off for a little while so that you could go and have a look in, and everyone could see where they'd found him. But now there is actually a museum on the site, and where the burial site was, they've glassed over it, so you can walk into the room and walk on the glass and kind of look down to where it was. It's fantastic. If anybody's visiting Leicester, I'd recommend seeing it.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I've joked a couple of times here on the podcast about just how young the United States is in compared to the rest of the world, in our government and our culture, and here we are, like 400 years ago, we there are buildings here that there are a few buildings that maybe go back 400 years, but England's been around so long that they lose their kings. They forget where they put them.
Yeah, we are careless. Like that.
Well, it would be careless of me not to ask you to tell us all about Monstacademy.
Okay, so this started in 2017. I wrote the first one, the Halloween Parade. And it's a younger reader's book, so I can't build for about ages 6 and 7 above, up to about ages 11. So it's a younger chapter book. And the premise behind it is that a young girl, Trixie Grimm, is going to a perfectly ordinary school. She's a perfectly ordinary girl, nothing special, but then her school closes. And she has to go to a school for monsters. It's the only school they can fit her in. And this school for monsters is a big scary building on top of a hill at the edge of the town, and obviously all of the ordinary kids are terrified of these monsters. They don't really know anything about them, and so when she's forced to go, it's not something that she looks forward to. But when she gets there, she finds that it's not exactly what she expected it to be. It's a very light-hearted, very funny series of books. So it's not scary, horrible monsters. It's not like Goosebumps. It's not that kind of monsters. But she makes friends with a girl named Gloria, who is a vegetarian vampire who hates blood and only eats parsnips, and Colin, who is a cursed werewolf, or should I say werepoodle. Every full moon he turns into a pink poodle. And things like that. It's very silly. The headmistress is called Miss Flopsbottom. So really appealing to the kind of lowest common denominator humour there for children. But
well, that's kind of humour that I adore.
Yeah. So and so do I, to be fair. And I've read it. I've got a young daughter. She was 6 at the time, 5, 6 at the time. And so I wrote those really for her. And then they've proved to be very popular, which is obviously great. But they were originally for her and for mine and her sense of humour, so they're things that really appeal to kind of 6-year-old, 7-year-old girls and boys, really.
That's awesome. Kids really do love monsters. It's incredible. You think, oh, this might be too scary for kids, but they just love them. Yeah,
they do. I mean, I'm a huge Terry Pratchett fan, and he wrote in one of his books in The Hogfather I think it was The Hogfather, that children need fairy tales not so that they know that monsters exist, but so that they know they can be defeated, which I think was a brilliant quote, and I think really does sum up children, really. They're not afraid of anything unless we kind of teach them to be afraid of it, and I think if you give them monsters, especially in a silly way, they love it. They love the kind of idea. And obviously, in the Halloween parade, I touch on the idea of actually, let's think of the logistics. If you go to school for monsters, where do the vampires sleep? Do they have a normal bed, or do they hang up on the curtain rails? How does the girl that turns into a cat every 3rd week, how does she go to the toilet when she's a cat? Does she need a litter box in the corner of the classroom? The kind of silly logistics of actually how it would work in real life. And I think, particularly a lot of the younger boy readers find that quite funny to imagine. I think it really appeals to their sense of humour.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that quote that you started with. I'm going to really mess it up here, but kids need to know that monsters exist not to scare kids, but to help kids understand that monsters can be defeated.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we have fairy tales. I'm pretty sure it was Hogfather. It was one of the Terry Pratchett books. They all blur into one when you read them as often as I do. But I'm pretty sure it was Hogfather.
You bring up an interesting point. Fairy tales, we're all familiar with, Grimm fairy tales and things like that. But I don't think many people are familiar with with the original Grimm fairy tales and how scary they are.
Yeah, they really were. I mean, they were a lot darker. I think it was Cinderella, when she killed the evil stepmother, she forced her to dance, didn't she, in red hot shoes or something like that, rather than just pushing her over the edge like we see the very Disney-fied version. But yeah, they were very grim, to use their name, really. They were grim.
Yeah. Why do you think that has changed over the years? I'm kind of happy, because some of those grim things, they're really grim, and I don't know if I would have wanted to read those to my kids. But
I don't know. I guess over time, I mean, they were written the 1800s. I guess in Germany, maybe sensibilities have changed. I don't know. I mean, my daughter's now 8, and she's just reading Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. So she's definitely into the kind of more gory aspects of those kind of things. She really likes The Raven. She likes that kind of story. Mm-hmm. Along with Goosebumps. So I think like we were saying with monsters, I think if you give children the opportunity to choose those kind of things, they're pretty good at self-regulating. I mean, until December, I was a primary school teacher, teaching year 6, which I think is your grade 7, I would guess, over there. So 10 and 11-year-olds. And, they're pretty good at making their own kind of decisions as to what it is they want to access and what they want to read. And I don't know, maybe we need to be giving them more exposure to these kind of classic tales. I know Neil Gaiman's incredibly good at doing that. The Graveyard Book and things like, stories like that are very dark. And when I grew up, we read Roald Dahl, and Roald Dahl is, he's always killing off parents and having gruesome injuries, and, you just have to read the twits or things like that. Even Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and look at the horrible things that happened to Veruca Salt and the kids in that,
Mm-hmm.
So I think, there's definitely an opening for that kind of.
Well,
gruesome.
One of the things you brought up was, we have to kind of let kids pick their own books and find a lot of their own books and make choices. I was recently at a kids expo, and we met thousands of families, and we met this one family, and beautiful young woman, and she was probably in that grade that you were taught, she was probably 10, 11, 12 years old, and she was there with her mom and her dad and her brother and her two sisters. And I said, hey, we're the Reading with Your Kids podcast, and do you guys like to read together? And little Melanie said, oh yeah, my mom reads to my brother and my sisters every night. And so we started talking about that, and I said, do you remember when your mom did that with you? Absolutely, yeah, it was great. I said, so do you love to read now? She goes, no, I hate to read. I never read. And I was kind of surprised, and we ended the interview. It turns out that now Melanie and her mom like to make TikTok videos on her iPhone. Yeah. But I was trying to dig a little bit deeper, just her and I, and she said, I just don't like people telling me what to read. I'm in school every day, and they say read this, read that, and I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to read. And because of that, she stopped picking books to read.
Yeah, I think it's a really valid point, and I know when I was teaching up until Christmas, we had a big push in school on making sure that as adults we were reading with the children, reading to the children every day, and it is hard because you've got to expose them to for want of a better word, classic text, but certainly for high level texts, to give them the vocabulary for their writing. There's a horrible conundrum in school in that we want them to write at a certain level, but in order to write at that level, they have to be exposed to the vocabulary, to the story structures, to things like that. And so we end up having to read those certain texts, which does sometimes force them to read things that they don't want to. And it is a really hard balance to find. I know when I was a kid, I hated reading until I was probably about 9. And then my dad gave me a copy of The Hobbit, but it was a graphic novel version rather than the text version. It was a graphic novel version. And I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with Tolkien's world. I fell in love with his language and the structure. And from that point, I loved reading. I would read anything that I could get my hands on. Still do to this day. But like you say, I think it's even as adults, if we're told to do something, or we're told, oh, you must like this, then we kind of rebel against it, don't we, a little bit? And I think as children, if they're told, oh, you must love reading, you must read, it's only natural that they'll rebel against it.
You bring up a really important point that I think we forget. We know that reading with our kids when they're younger, it exposes them to vocabulary, helps them build their vocabulary. And it's so important. Now, there are different, I was just doing some research, and the thing I just found a graphic. It said that, you read to your young kids at home for 20 minutes a day. They're exposed to over a million words a year.
Yeah.
And so, my 4-year-old, my 5-year-old, my 6-year-old, I absolutely want to do with this. But it continues on. But we forget about the fact that, if we're reading with our kids when they're in 5th and 6th and 7th grade, they're still getting that benefit. They're being exposed to these wonderful words that they otherwise wouldn't hear.
Yeah, exactly. And it is hard. It's hard as parents, isn't it? It's hard to always find the time, especially, life is a lot busier now than I think perhaps it was 20, 30 years ago. I don't know what it's like in the US, but in the UK, when I grew up in the 80s, it was relatively common, I guess. You'd have one parent at work, one parent at home, or certainly at home more often, and you don't have that anymore, certainly not as much in society. And it's that's just the way of the world. People, life is more expensive. People need to work longer hours and more hours, and it does have a knock-on impact on things like reading and things like, the creative arts. And I don't really know what the answer is or where we go with it, but, that's why I'm trying to write things that I know my daughter likes to read, that I know children would like to read, and trying to get them in, trying to make them more accessible as well. The Monstacademy books, because I publish them independently, I'm able to take them where I want them. And at the minute, all of the Monstacademy books are available, not just in kind of a standard edition, but in a dyslexia adapted edition, which I've worked on advice from the British Dyslexia Association and various teachers and people with dyslexia to kind of adapt the typeset, the layout inside, so that from the outside they look the same. There's no stigma there. I don't want different covers. I don't want it to be stigmatized. But on the inside, it's just laid out slightly easier, or slightly more spaced out, so that people with dyslexia or visual impairments can access it. Because I think, there's a whole area out there that these children don't necessarily have access to the same books as children without dyslexia.
Yeah.
Which I think is hard.
That was definitely one of the things that I wanted to bring up. This dyslexia-friendly format.
Yeah.
Can you go a little bit more into that and exactly what that is, and what processes did you have to go through to make your books available in that format?
So I spoke to people at the British Dyslexia Association, and there's advice on their website, there's guidelines and things like that. And there are various booksellers in the UK who kind of work more in depth with dyslexia. And I spoke to them about what would make it more accessible. There's a company over here called Barrington Stokes who do a specific line of texts of books for children with dyslexia. Sorry, I shouldn't use the word suffering, but children with dyslexia. Mm-hmm. But the problem is they are all specifically for that. They are all different books. They're not, common trade books in a different format. So they're not accessing the same text. What I wanted to do was keep the text the same, but format it slightly differently. Now, a part of that is different line spacing, double line spacing rather than line and a half, things like that. Not justifying the text at all, so it's all left aligned. From my research and from the feedback I've had from various people, is that people with dyslexia sometimes struggle because if you justify text, obviously the spacing between each word will vary line by line because they pad it out. So that makes it a lot harder to read. Changes with running headers and things like that. So it's more stylistic on the inside. But the reviews that I've had back, there's reviews on the Amazon page and on my website from parents saying, this is the first book my child was able to read without their overlay, without their coloured overlay and things like that. So I think it's definitely seems to be something that parents are crying out for. What I find frustrating, I suppose, is that the format I use for the dyslexia adapted editions, all the children that I've tried it on, whether they have dyslexia or not, find it easier to read. So children who don't have dyslexia found it easier to read than a standard formatted book. However, because the font is sans serif, so it's not got serifs, it's slightly bigger, it's slightly more spacing. They're reluctant to read it, is the feedback I've had, because it looks more childish, it looks more simple. So I think what's frustrating is if the big publishers started to just go with this easier to access font styling and typesetting, it would become the norm, so that we wouldn't need separate editions for people with dyslexia. We wouldn't need a separate formatting because everything would be accessible to everybody. But unfortunately, obviously, having different space and things like that, the books are slightly thicker. There's a different cost implication for printing them. I mean, I charge the same for standard or dyslexia adapted editions, but there is a slight cost implication, which I guess puts off traditional big publishers, really, which is a shame.
Well, it is a shame, and I don't know if I necessarily buy it, because I was really excited when audiobooks came out and ebooks came out, and I'm like, this is going to be great. Just imagine that you don't have to print the book, and so it's going to be so much more affordable. And then all of a sudden, ebooks cost the same as a regular book. I'm like, wait a minute,
exactly, yeah.
wait a minute. Well,
we lost that battle, didn't we?
Yeah. Well, it sounds too like, I don't know, and this is going to sound really, really dumb, but that's okay. I've said lots of dumb things in my life. but it almost sounds as if we created a lot of the challenges that kids with dyslexia have to deal with. If justifying text, that's a big deal. That's a big process. That's really hard. It's not natural. And for whatever reason that started, maybe people thought it looked cool or whatever. And a lot of people were able to adapt and deal with it, but it wasn't natural, and it left a lot of kids by the wayside. I want to give hats off to you for taking the time, taking the expense to create these dyslexia-friendly editions of your book. What was it? Was it your experience as a teacher that drove you to make that choice?
A little bit, but I was just looking online for local booksellers around me, local bookshops, because unfortunately there aren't any local bookshops in my hometown, certainly not within a 10-mile radius. And so I was looking a little bit further afield, and I just happened upon an article about a bookshop further down south in England that the owner was dyslexic and was specialised in these dyslexic books. And one of the authors that did the interview, she was talking about how she'd done a similar thing, but with adult books, I believe it was, and she'd released her adult books in dyslexia adapted editions. And I just saw it and I thought, actually, you know what, that's not a bad idea. Being a teacher, there are children with dyslexia or even children who have a lower reading age. But the problem is, if you're a child in in grade 6, grade 7, and you've got a reading age of grade 3 or grade 4, certainly in the UK, there are not a huge amount of books that are accessible that have the high interest point. Mm-hmm. And so I found a lot of children I was working with who had the lower reading age were getting fed up, they were getting frustrated with reading, not necessarily because they were struggling to read, although that was part of it, but because what they were having to read, because it was anything that at that point they could access, was very simple and very boring. And so this kind of, it helps a little bit with that. It's not necessarily targeted towards that, but by having it slightly easier to access, slightly broken down, broken down a little bit more, it makes it easier for those children as well who perhaps have a slightly lower reading age but want that high interest. Mm-hmm. And again, with the same vocabulary. I made the choice not to go through and not restructure the sentences and not kind of change the vocabulary, and that was quite a hard decision to make, because I know sometimes people with dyslexia, some of the advice I've been given is that sentences, for instance, that start with adverbial phrases can be more difficult to understand because there's more information they've got to retain. And so I had to make the choice, do I go through and completely rewrite it and restructure it for the dyslexia edition, or keep it the same? And in the end I chose to keep it the same, simply because I wanted it to be, like I'd said, not a completely separate story written for people with dyslexia, but the same text, the same story, but adapted to help them to access it. Mm-hmm. And I think there's quite a bit of a differentiation there between the two different things. So, yeah, it was partly from my experience as a teacher, partly from reading this amazing article. I can't for the life of me at the minute remember who wrote the article. It was probably about 3 years ago now, but yeah, it just had an impact on me. Actually, you know what? That is a good point. There isn't really a market for that. Well, sorry, there is a market, but there isn't really anybody servicing that market.
Well, I'm really glad that you made the choice. I think it was, brave in some ways, and also very selfless and very generous. So thank you very much for doing that.
Okay, so thank you.
So right now there are, if I'm correct, there are 3 books in the Monstacademy series: the Halloween Parade, the Magic Night, and the Egyptian Treasure.
There are actually 4. The Grand High Monster came out just before Christmas. I think it was December the 20th or something like that. So I released that just before Christmas. So there are 4 now, yeah. But just the Magic Knight as well isn't actually a narrative within the story. It's a choose your own adventure. So it sits within the same school. It's got the same characters in it, but obviously you take control of the story. I don't know if when you were younger, I know when I was, I read the amazing series Fighting Fantasies by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. And you'd go through the adventure, you'd roll the dice, you'd have battles, you'd win, you'd lose. And so I wanted to write something like that because, again, those books aren't out there anymore, these game books, or certainly not as many of them. And so, yeah, the Magic Knight is a game book that's been designed so that as you go through the story, you make the decisions within Monstacademy, whether you cast a spell, whether you go along the corridor, you use dice, you can make the decision yourself in some instances. I think there are 20 different endings in the book, but only 3 of them are what I would call good endings. The others you end up in detention or frozen solid or, turned into a frog, those kind of silly child-friendly endings. But it sits nicely within the Monstacademy universe. But, it's not a narrative, it's a choose your own.
Now, when you're writing that or when kids are reading that, so kids have the book, they read it, then they get to, say, page 19, and then they're presented with a choice, and depending on what choice they make, then they have to go to a different page?
Yeah, so it's even shorter than that. So each section, before they make a decision or before they go somewhere else, is on average, I would say, about a paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs. So probably you're not really reading more than half a page, and you jump all over the book. So, like when I do readings, when I go into schools and do creative writing workshops based on the Choose Your Own Adventure, or when I go into libraries and do readings, like I say to the children, when you finish this book, you'll be in the middle of it. The end is not the end. So there are, I think, 128 different sections. And so as you go through, you read number 1, you always start at number 1. It kind of eases you in, you get the choice to make whether you roll the dice, I think, for the first one. And if you get a 1 or a 2, you are a vampire. If you get a 3 or a 4, you're a werewolf. 5 and 6, you're a witch or a wizard, that kind of thing. And then, you go on into the book and it asks you, eases you in with, do you want to wear black shoes or white shoes to school? And they have different impacts. And the idea is, as you go through, decisions that you made earlier in the book may come back to have an impact later on. So, for instance, in one of the scenes, you're hiding in the headmistress's office trying not to get caught. And it's much easier to not get caught if you are, for instance, a witch or a wizard. Whereas if you're a werewolf or a vampire, it's much harder and you have to roll the dice again and you have to try and hide. And so different decisions that you make throughout the book have an impact later on. And items that you might pick up make the book easier later on. Or if you don't pick them up, it might be a bit harder. There's lots and lots of different stories that you can go through. My daughter's been reading it for about the last 2 years, and I think she's still not found all 20 different endings.
That's so cool. And talk about a book that could really make a difference in the life of a reluctant reader. Kids said, that young woman that I met in Chicago who said, I hate reading, I never read. Well, I don't want you to read. I want you to play a game. Here's a book.
Yeah.
Here's how you can play a game.
Exactly. Go on, sorry.
I was going to say, what a great idea.
Yeah, like I say, it's based on, again, books that I grew up with that for some reason just seem to have fallen out of favour with traditional publishers. I guess there's not the sales that they need to maintain it. But I loved them as a kid. Kids that I worked with in schools absolutely loved the idea. I run workshops based on the concept, but using stories that they know. So things like Little Red Riding Hood. We rewrite Little Red Riding Hood as a choose your own adventure. So Little Red Riding Hood leaves the house, she bumps into the wolf. Let's have the reader make a choice. Does she run away from the wolf, then head off to grandma's, or does she turn back to her house? If she turns back to her house, what happens then? Does the wolf follow her? And we talk about how decisions you make as an author or as a writer impact on the storyline. It's a great way to introduce children to that kind of decision-making process as a writer with something that they know really well, a story like Little Red Riding Hood or Cinderella or something like that, and really kind of pick it apart and make it much more interesting, make it more fun for them. You know, they can control it. They can choose what happens to the character in the story in any way that they want to. And that, like you say, for reluctant readers and reluctant writers as well, it really brings them in and really engages them with that kind of structure of the story and with the process of writing.
Yeah. And I think this would be a great book and a great experience for families to co-read together. The kids are reading and they're making some choice, and the parents are reading, going other directions. And what a great conversation starter it could be when you're driving the kids to soccer practice or dance, or just sitting around the table for dinner time.
Yeah, whenever I do the readings in a library, there's obviously the children there doing the reading along with me, and I always pick a dice thrower and a scribe to write down what we find and things like that. But you can always see a few of the decisions about, do you carry on talking during the lesson, or do you be quiet because the teacher's asked you to? And you can see all the children say, "Oh, I would be quiet, I'd be quiet," and you can see the parents in the background laughing, saying, "Well, you wouldn't be at your own school." So you can kind of see the thought process of the children thinking, right, well, if I make this decision, I'm probably going to get to carry on with the story. If I keep talking, that might be the end and I'll have to start again. So that cognitive process, that thinking through what is likely, that prediction of what is likely to happen next in the story if I do this, is also engaging them with that kind of thought process of, right, what will happen next, which is a key part of reading, isn't it, really? Prediction, along with, inference and retrieval and all the other kind of key domains. That prediction is important, and being able to think, right, what will happen next?
Yeah. Well, I love it. Tell everybody where they can find out more about you and all of your wonderful books.
So they can head to my webpage, which is mattbeighton.co.uk, so mattbeighton.co.uk, or there's, the usual online places, Amazon, etc., etc. You can find all the books on there. But yeah, for finding information about me, my school visits, my readings, things like that, the best place is to head to my webpage.
Well, we've had an awesome time discussing everything with the author of Monster.
We've gone from Hidden Kings to...
Yes, exactly. Hidden Kings to interactive stories. And we've been doing that with the author of Monstacademy, Matt Beighton. Matt, thanks so much for being part of the show.
No, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for everyone for listening.
Please be sure to join us for the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Rachel Giannini. She is the host of a great vlog called Quarantine with Rachel. She's also an expert in early childhood education. She shares some amazing insight into the development of young children, giving us some great advice so that we can take the time that we're all spending together during the great quarantine of 2020 and making that into some real quality time that we can grow closer together and also help our kids to thrive. That's the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to thank our guest, Matt Beighton. Be sure to check out the Monstacademy Series. Also want to thank our sponsor, Valerie Doherty, the author of The Big City Dance. Be sure to check out that book today. I want to thank my amazing team. I want to thank my producer, Fatima Khan. I want to thank my author ambassador, Peggy Cotto. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. I want to thank Augie the doggy for having my back here in the studio. But most of all, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Thank you so much for caring for your family, keeping them safe. And thank you so much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.